Right, so another key part of the screen experience beyond the HDR and, of course, the 120 hertz is VRR, variable refresh rate. Now, the concept here is that the GPU takes control of when the screen refreshes, in theory, producing smoother gameplay when the frame rate isn't at a straight 60, 30, or indeed 120 hertz. Lots to talk about on this one. But, John, let's talk about the welcome tour because we actually get a pretty fully featured VRR demonstration there, which kind of shows the experience, I guess, at its best.
Yeah, so I guess the usefulness of the welcome tour in this case is that it essentially proves to us that VRR actually does work, right? Like, because based on what you guys are about to say, like without this demo, there would be a lot more questions up in the air about what VRR and the Switch 2 actually can do. But thanks to the welcome tour, you can take it down into like single digit frame rates, and it covers the full range. So it actually does switch on low frame rate compensation after a certain point, and you do get the full range of VRR that looks exactly what you would hope, right? So you get the full up to 120 frames per second, down to like 2 or whatever it was. You can do it, and so it
Right.
works, and that's key. Is that we know that it works, it behaves as it should. We all know what VRR displays look like, what they should produce. Obviously, the idea is that when it's not divisible by the refresh rate, it's actually changing the refresh rate to like display the frames without like judder, without like doubling up frames, essentially.
Yeah.
So without that, if you displayed like 40 FPS or about 39 FPS, you would get plenty of single 16 millisecond frames, and then you would get like 33 millisecond frames, and that's what causes the judder. It's no problem here. But unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case with actual shipping games, right?
Yeah, I mean, Oliver, we've both tested this. Maybe you want to take point on this. Which game shall we begin with? Because we tested three major ones, really. Cyberpunk 2077, Hitman World of Assassination, and No Man's Sky, all of which have the option, at least, for unlocked frame rates, which should, in theory, deliver a VRR experience, right?
I think Hitman is most interesting, at least to me, because Hitman, if you look at this footage here, it's an unlocked game, and it appears to be unlocked in both portable and docked configurations. You can see here we're kind of typically like 35 to 45 FPS docked, but in portable mode, in this, the start of a mission in Hitman 3 here, if I swing the camera around, it's very smooth as we pan over the countryside. But when we get to that castle, when the camera is over that castle, all of a sudden it becomes very jerky. So I did count a brief cluster of frames during one of those drops where it feels jerky, and it looks to be running in the mid to upper 30s during that period. Right. So what's going on here is I don't think VRR is working properly with LFC. And it may be the case that VRR is working properly up to, down to 40 hertz, but past 40 hertz, it's no longer working correctly. And indeed, the welcome tour seems to indicate this. I believe what it does, like when you set the frame rate to 2 FPS, it says it's running at 40 hertz with 2 FPS LFC'd to 40 hertz, right? So there's some indication there that it's actually the minimum floor of that VRR would be 40 hertz, which is the same as it is, I believe, on Xbox commonly through FreeSync.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
So that would certainly make some sense. The other games are, to me, a little bit less interesting. So I tried Cyberpunk 2077 in performance mode, which notionally goes up to 40 FPS, and it suffers from some pretty inconsistent camera travel, so I'm not sure that VR is working correctly there. Again, it's frequently dropping frames, or at least we believe it is, based off of its performance in dock mode. Probably not reaching a full 40 FPS very often there. I also tried No Man's Sky, which is maybe a little bit more interesting. So planet side, it does seem to suffer from some bigger camera issues, some stutters just moving around. But in the space stations, in the anomalies, space stations, areas like that, not planet side, it seems smoother. So I counted one out by hand using high frame rate footage, and it counted to about 40 FPS. So there it was a little bit harder to tell if VR was working correctly or not. But I do almost feel a small range of frame rate smoothness, maybe between like 30 and 40 FPS ish. When I'm panning around planet side, I'm getting a little bit more fluidity when I'm looking up at the sky than I am looking straight ahead. Maybe that's in my head. I don't know. It's hard to tell exactly. But I think that there probably is some degree of VRR working correctly there. At least that's how it feels to me. But there are some occasional intermittent issues that just come from the complexity of this game. I'd have to imagine if VRR was working correctly, that's where the stutters are coming from. So yeah, I think overall it does seem like maybe VR is working properly on the system level, but you need developers to kick in LFC, which is a similar situation as we see on PlayStation. That could be the situation here. So it could just be like this early wave of software, but overall, we're not getting a very good VRR experience in these early titles, especially in key titles like Hitman, where they're running the game totally unlocked, right? That's one example. And they really kind of should have VRR to smooth that out. I mean, they should have a frame rate cap, in my opinion. But, you know, if you're going to use VR, you should be smoothing that out. And they're not doing that at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about frame rate caps, Oliver, and we do have them in Cyberpunk 2077 in the form of the quality mode. Mm-hmm. And similarly, No Man's Sky, you can engage locked frame rate mode. And I think, I don't know whether you agree, but I played both of those in both unlocked and locked modes. And even though locked is delivering a lower frame rate, 30 frames per second, perceptually it's smoother and looks looks better to my eyes than running unlocked with quote unquote VRR. So in the case where it is an option there, I wouldn't be using what we would consider to be VRR. It just doesn't look as good, right?
Right. No, you're absolutely right, and that's fundamentally the issue. Is that you're getting these. This is actually, I like to look at this as like the 2013 problem. When PlayStation 4 first launched, it felt like every developer was like, we can do 60 FPS now, but they couldn't. And you were getting all these games where they were just unlocking the frame rate, right? Like Sony first party was really guilty of this too. There was Knack, there was Killzone Shadowfall, and then there was infamous Second Son. And this kind of just kept happening. And it was the same problem. It was like this 30 to 40 FPS frame rate. It didn't look smooth, quite frankly. And that was due to lack of VR, which is why the fact that they would ship this without proper low frame rate compensation VRR, which seems to be possible, is so baffling. Because they can do it, at least on portable mode, right? But they don't.
Yeah.
And so, like, I guess the questions to raise then is, like, why? Like, what is it about the implementation that caused this? Were they even aware that it wasn't working properly? Is there something in there that makes it more difficult to implement that they weren't able to put in there? Like, that's the kind of questions I'm wondering about, because as if I was working on a product like this and this was an available feature, I feel like you would want to leverage this, right? Especially given the unlocked nature of these frame rates, especially Hitman. And they do kind of leverage it, but that also made me wonder, though, does Switch 2 have sort of like PS5, like where up to that certain point, it's automatic. But if you actually want to take advantage of low frame rate compensation, the developer has to do extra work. So maybe we're just seeing like an automatic function that does work without any developer input down to like 40 FPS. And then if you actually want the full range, you got to actually implement it. And maybe they haven't done that.
Yeah, it's all conjecture at the moment.
Right. We don't know. Really know. We have no idea.
However, if it was like a fully fledged system feature, you would expect VRR to also work on Switch 1 games running under the backwards compatibility layer. And I did test this. Dragon Quest Builders 2 is highly volatile. And, even when you're sort of notionally in the sort of 40 to 60 FPS territory, there's no VRR there. And Minecraft is an interesting one because you can actually adjust a frame rate cap at 5 FPS intervals, which is really interesting. And so, I was able to test 35, 40, 45, 50 frames per second camera pan. You can tell it's not VRR. So Switch 1 games definitely aren't using VRR, perhaps indicative that there isn't a sort of system level override for VRR. Whether that extends to Switch 2 games, we don't really know. So early days on this one. Clearly the feature is in there and working because the Welcome Tour proves it. But the actual implementation in other games so far, I'd say it's disappointing. Any final words, Oliver?
No, just to emphasize a point that I think people miss sometimes, which is like most console software is running flat for the most part at 30, 40, or 60. And that is the case with a lot of early Switch 2 titles, or it seems to be the case. Now, maybe a title like Mario Kart, I mean, it would be hard for me to tell, right? But maybe Mario Kart is like dipping to 55 FPS in some moments, right? In Switch 2 in portable mode. And there are probably some examples of that right now that we're not yet aware of, just because it would be very, very time consuming to try to track that kind of thing down. But in general, games on consoles, typically they're targeting these frame rates. And as long as there isn't some like inclement spike in GPU or CPU load, they don't really need VR necessarily if they're well targeted, if they're working correctly. It's just in these kind of inclement scenarios, like a title like Cyberpunk, which might just be too heavy to always stay within a 25 millisecond window, for instance, in performance mode. Or a title where the developers just decide, okay, we're not going to cap it, we're just going to let it roll unlocked, right? Those are some scenarios in which VR can help you a lot. And here it does not seem to be helping you as much as we'd like, if at all, in some of those games. So this is an area where I'd like to see some improvement. In theory, this should be improvable because of what we see in the Welcome Tour, at least, which does exhibit very, very compelling LFC down to 2 FPS.